we improvise when we operate in an open-ended context, in an open world, which cannot be fully described ex ante. Therefore, human initiative is inevitably there. Generic rules cannot be, and cultural norms cannot be effective in themselves when we grapple with new problems, new issues, idiosyncratic conditions which come up all the time. Hence, improvisation is important, and people do try to interlock their behaviors. So you can have an organized system through this interlocking of behaviors without necessarily having this formal representation, but up to some extent. And this does not have durability. It does not create this kind of predictability that may be important. Knowledge is narrative, the stories people share and tell one another, and action is practical, again, in the sense that I defined it earlier, in taking rules and applying them in concreto, in particular circumstances. So this is the kind of scheme that, the way I think about organization, and the kind of three ontological components I think are important. All of them are important, and I emphasize these are not perspectives. They can be approached from, they can be turned into perspectives, but for me, to the question, what must organization be like given our experience of the world, my answer is that organization must be three things: representation, practice, and action. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions, so François can give you the microphone if you wish.
Harry, a two-part question. You present actions, representations and practices almost in a kind of synchronic way. So kind of actions lead to representations, or whichever direction it goes. I just wonder whether, first point, I wonder if they're kind of mutually implicated to the point that they're kind of diachronic rather than synchronic. So in other words, you know, you create, for example, propositions are created, propositions in terms of the knowledge area, propositions in terms of representations are created in narrative. It's not that the narrative then leads to the representations occurring in real time rather than subsequently. So that's my first point, that the kind of things aren't sequential, they're mutually implicated to the point they go on concurrently.
Yes, yes.
The second question. In relation to actions, you seem to be focusing on human action when you describe them. And I just wonder, when you talked about the traffic lights going out in Greece, or the crisis in China, or indeed if suddenly there was a power cut here, I wonder if those actions by non-human agents are in fact still actions within the organisation rather than external triggers to it. So in other words, part of that cycle of organising is the serendipitous or unpredictable non-agential parts that are still actions that still bear upon it, which seem to be missing in your account of it. Are they outside the organisation?
I would hesitate to give the status of agents, the agency to material things. For me, traffic lights going out, earthquakes, fires, and so on, these are events. Events in an open-ended world to which we've got to respond. Obviously, you cannot ignore them. They're there. You've got to do something about them. But I'm not convinced. It's something that I have to think more about, I have to confess. But I'm not convinced that they've got to have the status of actors, of agency, to be able to do something about it. For me, to be a kind of situated accommodation is precisely this. It's not different. I'm speaking to you. I detect some puzzlement in your face. You don't get what I'm saying. So if I'm attentive to the conversation, I've got to take it in and reformulate my point and try to... so this is kind of situated accommodation, not very different from seeing fire suddenly out there, and I've got to do something about it. The magnitude of consequences is different, obviously. I may disappoint you but in my conversation, but I better put out the fire. But still, it is that kind of events that I'm talking about.
I know that it's a try to make label on the Maurice approach, for instance, but it's very difficult to understand the separation you make between practice and action. You know, practice is nothing without action, and action without practice.
Sorry.
And action.
The distinction. You're puzzled by the distinction?
Yeah. I think that using this word to separate practice and action makes the things very difficult to understand.
Well,
I cannot
you see,
see practice without action and action without...
Well, the practices are instantiated through our actions. So we have practices of grading scripts, of, in the university practices for organizing conferences, presenting our papers. These are practices. But then again, these practices, however, in themselves, they need to be seen in action, as it were. And action is different from the practices per se. We highlight different things. So the practice in my university of, let me give a better example. Julian Orr's example of the practices of repair technicians in telling stories to one another, professional pride, striving for excellence in what they do, trying to satisfy the customer, but also at the same time to please the bosses up there. These are kind of practices which they have developed over time. And obviously these practices are instantiated in action. But we've got to have that action there, because this is also the feedback loop. Now, action is something which comes back, and it forces, it compels us to revise our practices. And it makes us revisit our practices. Precisely because we instantiate our practices in open-ended worlds. I forgot to mention that the reason why this is important is because of the radial structure of categories. The categories we use are not homogeneous categories. So, take a photocopier technician, take a photocopier machine, for example. When the designer of the manual at Xerox has a canonical image of a photocopier machine, but the photocopier machine, which has certain elements at its core, but at the same time, there are variations of those elements. So the very category as a photocopier machine is not stable. There are types of, and the way it is used particularly, it becomes even more open-ended in open-ended contexts. That kind of open-endedness, I want to bring it into the analysis. Because open-endedness, it is, if you like, the fuel that drives changes, new things, the emergence of things that we didn't think about.
Yes. Gisèle Hilou, I am a surgeon and a philosopher, and I am interested to have your point of view on when a representation deals with a non-linear object. My example is a critically unstable patient, for example. You seem to have completely dismissed the counterintuitive or the paradoxical type of thought. Or, let's say, when you think about improvisation, you have a linear type of thinking.
What makes you think that?
Because of your if and then.
Yes.
It seems very deterministic, linear, simple thought process.
Okay.
So I am not criticizing.
No,
just
it
thinking,
would be perfectly okay.
What about other types of thought processes? Because practices and actions when dealing with nonlinearity and dynamic processes is quite different.
Good point.
How do you think?
As someone who has been inspired by complexity science, it would be foolish of me to dismiss nonlinearity. Absolutely, it's there. At the same time, that's why this is what I mean by ontological components. The world is stable to some extent, and that stability is, I think, to account for that stability, we've got to find a way. It's not that everything is non-linear. It's not that that kind of stability is expressed by the if, then, x, y. To organize activities, this is what you do. That, when these kind of errors occur in the machine, then photocopier technicians must act in a particular way. When you go to your bank,